Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to my locals. You can join there and support me directly and engage with the channel. Today, for Lord of the Rings Decisive Battles, we're going to cover the twin battles of Osgiliath. And while we're waiting for some people to come in, we'll just start with some geography and history to set up these two battles. So Osgiliath is Sindarian and a compound of the word Os, which means fort or citadel, and Gileath, which means house of stars, meaning citadel of the stars. Osgiliath was the former capital of Gondor. The city is situated on both sides of the river Anduin, so there's the eastern half and the western half, with one bridge connecting either half. Osgiliath is approximately equidistant from Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul, which used to be Minas Ithil. From a long decline, the city was abandoned in the Third Age, 2475, after being overrun by Uruk-hai. While the city was ruined, its strategic location necessitated a garrison be kept there to check Sauron. Moreover, the land of Ithilien between Osgiliath and Minas Morgul was a disputed region between Sauron and Gondor. Let's see, we have Spinley, Minoan, and Vingul. Hello, everyone. The prelude to the first battle, which takes place in June 20th, T.A. 3018. So from T.A. 2901 onward, the land of Ithilien was under the dominion of Sauron. Yet he could not cross the Anduin in force. Sauron needed time to develop his strength. In T.A. 2951, Sauron began searching for the One Ring. He revealed his power of fortifying his position and mobilizing his forces. In T.A. 3009, Gollum was captured by Sauron and learned the name of Baggins in the Shire. In T.A. 3017, Aragorn captured Gollum in the Dead Marshes. This alarmed Sauron and sent his Nazgul to attack the forces of Gondor at Osgiliath. Sauron had two purposes: one, to test the strength of Gondor, reconnaissance and force, and two, to unveil the Nazgul and decide to deceive the wise into thinking they would not be used for the hunt of the ring. Let's see, we've also got, okay. So the first battle, now if this is portrayed in the movies briefly as a flashback in the Two Towers, where Boromir is giving a victory speech for his defense of the city. And this section, it's mentioned in the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring. Boromir gives his brief little summary of this. And there's other supplementary materials like the Unfinished Tales, which add some more details to this. So at the Council of Elrond, Boromir states that along with the assumed orcs, they weren't mentioned by name, but one can hardly imagine Sauron attacking without orcs. Easterlings and Haradrim were used to attack the city. Boromir claims that what defeated the men of Gondor most was this evil presence around the Black Horsemen and the fear and dread that they engendered in the troops. Men were struck with fear and left their posts. The eastern side of the city was taken. The last bridge was defended by Boromir, Faramir, and a company of soldiers. They destroyed the bridge and then swam across the Anduin to the other side. Besides Boromir and Faramir, only 2 men survived for a total of 4. So this actually puts a different color on it than in the movie. Because in the movie, it sounds like Boromir defends Osgiliath, when in fact all he did was get 4 guys out from losing the eastern half of the city. And the reason why Sauron didn't cross then was he wasn't prepared for such a crossing. He was merely testing the strength of Gondor. So on the aftermath of this, on the same day in Mirkwood was attacked, which allowed Gollum to escape, most likely coordinated so they could follow Gollum to whoever had the ring, because Gollum didn't tell Sauron everything he knew. He hated Sauron as he hated the Bagginses because they were competition for the ring. So Gollum only told as much as he felt he needed to, even under torture. The Nazgul were then sent to the Shire to apprehend the ring. By the end of June, news of this defeat had reached the rest in the Shire. Gandalf was uneasy upon hearing the news, and talking with the refugees who themselves refused to talk of what had befell them there because of some evil, which, as we know, was the Nazgul. Sauron determined that Denethor's strength was stronger than he had thought. From then on until the events of the Return of the King, Sauron mustered his forces to gain an overwhelming advantage before crossing the river. When Aragorn revealed himself to Sauron using the Palantir, Sauron sped up his timetable to make the second attack on Osgiliath and then Gondor. So a few things to be mentioned real quick about this particular engagement is, first of all, the destruction of the bridge, which presumably was stone, isn't really described in any detail. And of course, the explosives are only used by Saruman, so it's not clear how it was done. But one wonders if that was what actually stopped Sauron, because at this point, Sauron doesn't have any means to cross the River Anduin. And it's conceivable he was hoping to take the bridge intact. Because if he took the bridge intact, he could then eventually drive to the west side and then move into the fields of Pelennor itself and begin the siege of Gondor a year before it actually did. So arguably, the holding operation, which whittled down a company of men led by Boromir and Faramir to 4 men, was the price that it took to destroy the bridge, which seems to have been a price worth paying given how tight the victory margins were in the Battle of Pelennor Fields anyhow. The other thing is we see that Sauron is a expert strategist. He like the magician, he says, look at the hand, not the hand that I'm not showing you. So the hand that he's showing you is the Nazgul being used to attack Osgiliath to create the deception that they won't be used to find the ring. But that's merely just a blind. And to also launch a reconnaissance in force to test the strength of Gondor. Now, the prelude to the second Battle of Osgiliath, 2 days after Frodo had left Faramir and Henneth Anun, the next day Faramir went to Caer Andros and investigated his preparedness to repel an assault. Horses were kept on the western bank for a mobile reserve. He then rode south to strengthen the garrison at Osgiliath. Faramir barely made it back to Minas Tirith when Gandalf, driving away the fell beasts and Nazgul that pursued him. The next morning, Denethor demanded that Faramir defend the ruined city of Osgiliath. Denethor was warned that Sauron could suffer 10 times as many losses as Gondor and still win. That was from Faramir. Yet he did not relent. Denethor's reasoning was this. North of Osgiliath was Caer Andros, and to the south was the land of Lebanon. And in both directions, the enemy could not cross. In the case of the former, because of the marshes, so between Caer Andros and Osgiliath, there were marshes, which Denethor deemed to be impassable. And then from Osgiliath to the sea, the river was deemed to be too wide to be crossed. Now, Faramir says that the Lord of the Nazgul's well had floating barges that Sauron had constructed, and they were constructed by an orc chief called Gothmog, who was under the command of the Witch King. And Caer Andros was assaulted and taken on March the 10th, TA 3019, as a preliminary move to attack Osgiliath, which was attacked on March 12th, TA 3019. Sauron's hosts, which were not numbered, we know that it was roughly around 60,000 troops attacked Gondor and fought in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. So we can assume that this was only a portion of that whole host, because even in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, that host comes in waves and is still crossing over. So it's plausible that if the total force of Sauron deployed were 60,000, maybe he deployed 20,000 as the van. So in that case, there were the plan that Mordor had was to build a large fleet of barges and floats to force a crossing on a widest possible front. Because if you have a narrow front to cross, remember the bridge has been destroyed by Boromir and Faramir and their one company, it's easy to have a smaller force counter a larger force on a river crossing by just placing those troops as they come across. But if you can widen the front, you can stretch them so thin that there's no way they can hold you off. And so in that case, Faramir's troops were just swept away. There was no way in which they could have held him off. Now, they inflicted more casualties. They inflicted some casualties, but less than they'd hoped. Because remember, I mean, these are orcs. These aren't like, even the tough men of the Easterlings and Haradrim who fought to the death even outside the Black Gate. So, that being the case, Faramir retreated to the Causeway forts, 2 forts that were on either side of the Causeway Road leading to the gates of Minas Tirith, which provided a position of strength for a last stand. Yet the forces of Sauron and his Nazgul were more than able to overpower this position. Faramir fell back into the Ramos Echoer, a line of advanced fortifications in front of Gondor itself, but was too few to defend it, which was breached by March the 13th. By this point, Faramir had been struck down by the Black Breath of the Nazgul and would thence be taken to Denethor's quarters. Prince Imrahil of the Lamroth rode out to rescue Faramir and the refugees from Osgiliath and Car Andros. And at this point, the Siege of Gondor begins, which will be next week's episode. So the assessment here then is Sauron definitely used his first attack on Osgiliath to deceive the wise into thinking he was not sending his Nazgul to destroy the morale of the Gondorian soldiers and attack them from the air. Sauron wisely tested the east side of Osgiliath first with a reconnaissance in force that gave him valuable intel. He then was forced to cross the river sooner than he wished when Aragorn revealed himself via the Palantir. Sauron really could not have failed to cross the river. Everything was in his favor. The spirited resistance of Faramir was in the end futile, as Faramir himself told his father. Sauron also showed correct understanding of river crossings. The best way to cross a river is all along it, bridges, pontoons, etc. Form choke ignore choke points that a numerically smaller force could defend if you just tried to cross at a single point. Sauron assured Faramir that he would not be able to stop him. In the twin battles of Osgiliath were the preludes to the Siege of Gondor and the Battle of Pelennor Fields. It is also illustrative in illustrating Tolkien's knowledge of river crossings. Now, part of the problem for this episode is there really isn't that much written down about the two battles of Osgiliath, but nonetheless, I believe they're important to cover on their own, because on the one hand, the first battle sets up in part the Ring and the Nazgul, and is part of Sauron's broader grand strategy to attack Gondor. He doesn't yet know how strong Gondor is. The other thing that I think, and this is something that is not specifically stated by Tolkien, but is consistent with themes in The Return of the King, the idea that the Palantir represents, in a fantasy setting, the equivalent of modern-day telecommunications, which in Tolkien's day would have just been the radio and maybe the television when this came out, is the idea that people can kind of see what they want to see, and if you know what kind of information to feed somebody, they can be led to believe the wrong thing. So to this point, Denethor, who's never considered a foolish man, he's considered one of the wise, but he's also been deluded and deceived by Sauron. And so his reasoning, again, this goes back to my discussion on the crossing of the Fords of the Eyes, and especially the second battle. There's this fog of war that's going on, and Tolkien has this great insight into how people make decisions in the fog of war. The decision on paper that Denethor comes to isn't manifestly ridiculous like it's portrayed in the movie, because in the movie it's portrayed the orcs have already taken the western side, which they had not taken yet. What ends up happening is the marshlands to the north of Osgiliath would be difficult, if not impossible, to cross, and the wide river to the south. Now, on paper, that's somewhat sensible, but there's two things that Denethor didn't take into account. One, the weakness of Gondor, and two, Sauron's overwhelming numbers and his strategy of barges. But what I think was going on is that Sauron was feeding Denethor false information, making Denethor think that his forces were stronger than they actually were. The Gondor could hold this fight. And nobody knew that he had a Palantir until his own suicide on the funeral pyre. So I think it's an educated guess and a reasonable guess that Denethor's plan, which would have been reasonable under a different set of circumstances, was in part the result of him being fed information that made Sauron appear weaker than he was. Because in the later on, when he's about to commit suicide with Faramir, he tells Gandalf, "You can't stop the forces of the East now." It's almost like he's been broken in spirit, like he expected that they could do better, and now they're just completely swept away, and he's hopeless. Now, again, that's an educated guess, but I think it's consistent with everything that Tolkien has said about the Palantir and how it feeds information into people, and of course how the fog of war works. But the Palantir's fog of war goes both ways, right? Because Aragorn takes the Palantir, the one from Isengard, and it shows himself to Sauron, which actually speeds up the attack on the second battle of Osgiliath. Sauron doesn't know that Aragorn doesn't have the ring. he assumes that Aragorn must have the ring, because why else would Aragorn reveal himself? So in that case, we have a deception on the part of the free peoples of Middle-earth, which Tolkien is telling us happened. So it's very reasonable to believe that Sauron was feeding Denethor these false information in order to make him believe that, hey, you know what? It turns out that maybe we are strong enough to hold the crossing. The other thing that's interesting here is the idea of the crossing itself. And maybe since this is two battles that take place, it might bear to compare them to the two fords of the Isen. Because in each case, the first battle was a reconnaissance in force to test the strength of the enemy. And in each case, if that had been pursued more vigorously, it would have been disastrous for the free peoples of Middle-earth. Now, in Rohan, it's just a ford, so they didn't need barges or bridges to get across. The Anduin was a serious obstacle to Sauron's crossing. I mean, Denethor was not wrong in that. It stopped in cold in his tracks in 3018. So the difference here was, though, that there was no real deception on Saruman's part. Saruman just wanted to kill Theodred and test the strength of Rohan. Sauron wanted to direct everybody's attention away from his real goal of gaining the ring, which was only partially successful, because ultimately Gandalf suspected as much and told Frodo to leave at a certain point, even if he didn't show up. And of course, we all know who read the book. He got delayed. They finally meet up in Rivendell. But by that point, the bird had flown the nest. But none too soon, because the house in Crickwillow, where the 5 hobbits were staying, because I think Fatty Bogler is the one that stays behind, was attacked like the day after they go into the Old Forest. So it was close. I mean, it almost came off. Sauron's grand deception in the first battle almost came off. He almost got the ring. So but it's always these little things that end up tipping the scales one way or the other. And they're kinds of things that would be very difficult for someone, without even with modern communications, to be able to see. Now, the second battles, I think what's a little different is the second battle of the Fords of the Isen was probably better conceived than the second battle of Osgiliath, because Faramir was correct. The forces arrayed against them were so great that even if they inflicted 10-1 casualties, Sauron could still easily carry the day. Isengard's Isengard's strength was not quite so overweening. It was still a poor decision to defend the second fort of the Isen, but it could have been much worse. The other thing that's interesting too is the speculating on how the bridge was destroyed. I mean, if it's a stone bridge, if it's a wooden bridge, you could set it on fire. So that's one thing. Or if it's a combination stone wood bridge, you could set the wood on fire and then leave it. Because if it's stone, I think the only way you could destroy it would be to just pry it apart with mason's tools, which would take a long time. So, or which is not stated, you could crash ships into it. But I don't think, if something like that were done, I think Tolkien would have mentioned it. So I think the smartest thing we can assume is that the reason why the company of soldiers suffered such heavy losses in the first battle of Osgiliath was because they were probably covering forces who were basically just prying apart the bridge, stone by stone, using mason's tools. So in that regard, yeah, you could lose a whole lot of guys trying to cover that. But given the cost of not doing it, and Gondor being overrun before Rohan was ready to give aid, it was with Theoden still in his dotage. Yeah, that would have been really bad. The idea of a wide crossing with barges and floats is interesting, because one of the things that you'll see in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, which is a sort of like technology comparison to what Tolkien has, we have that when Alexander the Great crossed the Jektartes River, he basically inflated animal skins and then had his troops just, swim across the river with these almost like water wings, but they're animal skins that are inflated. Caesar, of course, built a bridge to cross the Rhine. I guess the reason why Sauron didn't build a bridge is well, I was going to argue you could argue he lacked the construction skills, but when we get to the Siege of Gondor and you see that he's got trenches and catapults and siege towers, he does seem to have the entrenching skills necessary. I think the reason why Sauron didn't build a bridge, at least initially, is speed. I think he was probably trying to attack before Aragorn was revealed, because he believed Aragorn had the ring. So rather than lack of engineering expertise, one could argue that Sauron didn't have the ring, or didn't build a bridge because he didn't have he wanted to have speed to get to the siege of the city before Aragorn could get everything set up. The other thing too is it is interesting that Boromir notes the men of the East specifically, Aesterlings and Haradrim, which makes me think that he viewed them as a more serious threat. As we read in the battles of the Eisen, the orcs were often too short to fight the men of Rohan, and it was only the Dunland Axemen and Uruk-hai that could break in and kill Theodred. And we know that the Easterlings were doughty fighters throughout the Return of the King. So it seems likely to me that the reason why Boromir doesn't mention the orcs by name is they're just considered, cannon fodder. And the men of the East were considered a more serious, potent threat. So they were named. What's interesting is that the troop counts are not numbered. We're not told how many soldiers. Well, we were told it was a company. So I'm guessing Tolkien is using just traditional British numbers for a company. But as far as the second battle, we're not told how many men Faramir took, and we're not told how many forces Sauron brought to the attack. I'm just guesstimating 20,000 because out of a force of 60,000, that's so large. It's coming in, sequenced segments. I think 3 groups of 20,000 men marching in column is plausible as a plausible formula here. The other thing is, it's urban combat primarily. Now, urban combat in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, which is the sort of like time technology level that Tolkien is getting at, was generally very hazardous. Now, Osgiliath was an abandoned city, so that was slightly different. But in a normal context, in a siege, because you have buildings, 10, maybe 20 stories. Sorry, 1, maybe 2 stories. I think 2 stories might have been the max you could have in a city like in antiquity. You could drop a tile on someone's head and kill them. So a woman or a child could kill a soldier just by chance. So it really upped the danger level. Now, of course, Osgiliath was abandoned, but as we saw in even modern times, the sort of broken down, abandoned urban cities in urban combat favor the defender. So I think what we can also assume is, given how rapidly Sauron took the west side of Osgiliath, is that he just massively outnumbered Faramir. Because otherwise, you would think that, well, wouldn't that allow him to put up more of a defense? Well, not if he's massively outnumbered. There's only so much you can do. So, if a company was what was sent in the first battle, one could argue that Faramir had less than a company in the second, because Gondor is in a weaker position vis-a-vis 1 year earlier. So yeah, this is a real long shot and really bad idea, which the movie slightly exaggerates, but yeah, it was still a really bad idea. And the issue here too is with the river. What we'll get to later when we get to the Battle of Pelennor Field is, of course, that's exactly where the pirates of Umbar were expected to sail up. And so this river, which I think the Anduin comes from the Falls of the Rorris down into the Sea of Belfast, is basically the key geographic feature here. And if it weren't for that river and the marsh and the 2 cities, Caer-Andros and Osgiliath, Sauron could have quite easily marched directly into Gondor and besieged it far earlier than he actually did. And I think it's that geographic feature that, more than anything else, buys time for the free peoples of Middle-earth to make up for lost time. The dotage of Theoden, the losing of the ring, the scattering of the fellowship, all of these things, are setbacks for the free peoples that, every bit of time that can be bought is necessary. And the first Battle of Osgiliath buys time because it destroys the bridge that prevents Sauron from crossing over in 3018, a year early, before anybody's even remotely prepared to defend. The second battle is much ill-advised. I think it didn't really buy time at all. I think Faramir's troops and the refugees of Car Andros would have been better used in the defense of Minas Tirith itself. That's sort of Denethor's folly and his mistake, which I believe one can make an educated guess and say that Sauron was appearing weaker in order to induce Denethor to make this decision. Because let's think about this, right? Maybe there's a similarity here. The first battle of the Eisen was the goal was to kill Theodred. Theodred was a powerful leader and a powerful warrior. Well, I'm sure Sauron knew that Faramir was a powerful leader and warrior, and either his goal was to kill Faramir or to incapacitate him with the Black Breath. So it's quite conceivable that Sauron's strategy for the second Battle of Osgiliath was to feed a line of false information to Denethor, to get him to think that he was strong enough to defend the crossing, to get him to deploy Faramir, whom he already viewed as expendable. He wished that Boromir had lived and Faramir had died. To then kill Faramir and hopefully, or at least incapacitate Faramir so that he could more easily take the siege, fearing that Faramir could motivate the troops. Now, while Faramir is out of the fight during the siege, Gandalf is there, and when the Battle of Pelennor Fields develops, Rohan brings Éomer, Éowyn, Theoden, and then Elfhelm, and then, Aragorn brings his own guys, the three, Legolas, Gimli, Aragorn himself, men from Lebanon, and then also Prince Imrahil of the Ranwolf comes out. So there's still a lot of, quote, heroes on the field, but overall, the siege, the two battles of Osgiliath are important as a framing device, showing us how important the River Anduin was as a crossing to limit Sauron's westward expansion. And it's a real bottleneck, and it really impinges on his ability to just sweep all before him. And it shows that Tolkien understands the ideas of, again, the fog of war. He's very good at that. Buying time by destroying bridges, delayed, rear guard battles, and then also how to cross a river, right? Ideally, you'd want to build a bridge of your own. But if you're strapped for time or want to advance on as wide a front as possible, then, of course, what you do is you'd use pontoons or barges, or, as Alexander the Great did, inflated animal skins. So this is a bit of a shorter episode today, guys. Let's check out the chats. Spindley, who's watching and hasn't commented? Minoan, Denethor is one of my least favorite characters. Well, I think Denethor in the movie is played up to be a little ridiculous, but Denethor in the books is more of a tragic hero, or he's more like an anti-hero. He's asked at one point, what would he like for his life? And he says he wants everything to go back like it used to be, when he was younger and steward of Gondor. And he's just an old man that can't change with the times. And his own madness brings him down. Minoan, chat's very quiet today. Yeah, it is. I'm trying to get more people to tune into Lord of the Rings. I was hoping that, given broader cultural themes right now, I might be able to do that. Minoan, I didn't like him in the books. I mean, fair enough. Okay, well, Sauron did. So Nathan C.J. Hood asks, why not attack Car Andros and come down that way? Well, Sauron did attack Car Andros, but I think the issue with coming that way in force is that to the south is marshland. So between Car Andros and Osgiliath is marshland. And that would be less feasible to cross. Whereas that creates even more of a bottleneck, because you just can't have a bunch of boats and float across a marsh. Furthermore, Sauron expected reinforcements from the pirates of Umbar. So if he was operating on the river system of the Anduin, then what he could do is theoretically link up with, or at least secure the entry point for the pirates to then also bring reinforcements. So there's that. And that's all I got for tonight, guys. Tomorrow is my roundtable with Keith Preston, Swith and Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. That's going to be at 3 p.m. EST. I have surprise content on Saturday, which I'll be announcing a little later tonight on Twitter. And next Thursday will be the Siege of Gondor. So good night, guys, and see you soon.